Salim, a momentous occasion on the 12th when Britain went to the polls, United Kingdom went to the polls and elected Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party with a resounding majority. Just quickly off the top of the head, what does this mean for you and what does it mean for Canada?
Well, most importantly, the word historic is overused, but it was a historic victory for the Conservative Party under Boris Johnson. And what it means for us in Canada, given the fact that our election happened 2 months ago, is that those people who will begin to look at the British election and the result need to compare that result and the performance of the Conservative Party and what it means for Canadian politics. That means we didn't have a Conservative Party going into the October election. What we had was nominally a Conservative Party only in name, but it was simply another version of the Liberal Party. The PPC, which is the truly alternative Conservative Party, will now be in a much stronger position to get its message out that we could not get out during that 4 weeks of election campaign. And it was a very new party, barely a year old. And the PPC was faced with immense obstacles from the establishment parties. So back to the British election. This was actually a rout, an absolute rout of the British establishment, the media, the globalists, and we need to talk about that in a moment, about the globalist establishment leaders, the Labour Party, the organized left, the academia. It was a total rout.
Don't forget the media.
That's what's said, the media. Robert, only the week leading into the election, in fact, 24 hours, before the voting began, the entire Wednesday evening, I think many of us were reading the British paper. I was, and listening to the BBC, the North American broadcast. And there was a consensus, and I believe now we can see it. It was a fabricated consensus that the vote is very close and it can go either ways. That the Labour could, the media was saying, begin to imagine the possibility, the likelihood of Jeremy Corbyn being the next Prime Minister of Britain. And then the result came the next day, 24 hours later after the voting began. And as I just said, it was a rout. The Conservative Party gained an absolute majority. As the press is reporting, it is an 80-seat majority in the House of 650 members. And the Labour was trounced.
Where did we hear this before, where the polls and the pundits are predicting a close race or, certainly not what the outcome is? Hillary Clinton, the United States, we've seen this before. They go tooth and nail right to the end to try to convince people that things are going to go their way. And of course, they're wrong again.
Oh, absolutely. And that's exactly what was in our mind, in my mind, in your mind, that this was nothing new. The media is the one that is pushing in a direction. So the corporate media now is against the people. It is in fact against democracy. The corporate media is globalist, as is the academia, the elite. So as I have been saying, the establishment elite. That was the case in the United States. Over 90% of the professoriate class across the United States, and especially in its major universities, the Ivy League schools, they voted for Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, one commentator on Sky News Australia said that Jeremy Corbyn and his Labour Party was elected by the inner city middle class elites. Now, you and I have bandied that word back and forth all the time, elites, and it sounds almost conspiratorial. But it's a phenomenon. It is a definite phenomenon. And it's not just in Canada with our elites, that we call the Laurentian elites or the establishment elites, but over in Britain, Australia, the Anglosphere, Europe, it is a phenomenon. There is an elite class pushing an agenda.
There's always been an elite class, but the difference is that this elite class over the last 50 years has totally, and particularly since the end of the Cold War in 1992, the elite class has turned its back on its own people, that is the nation state. The elite class is now globalist. That's what we need to talk about it. The 2016 referendum in Britain, the June referendum on Brexit, and you see the map of that referendum, or if you can recall the map of that referendum, and then you see the map of the voting result on Thursday evening in UK, is almost the same map.
You can overlay one on top of the other and not distinguish between the two, with except for some minor exceptions.
Precisely, the Leave vote was concentrated in the big metropolitan centers, primarily, number one, London and its suburbs.
I think you mean the Remain vote, don't you?
Yeah, I'm talking about the 2016 election.
Yeah, the Remain was London, yeah.
The remaining vote, it was heavily concentrated on the metropolitan centers across Britain, so London, Birmingham, Manchester. These were the places where the concentrated vote took place. These are the places, that is like in case of Canada, which we have talked about, Toronto, the GTA, Montreal, Ottawa, Calgary, or Vancouver, more precisely. Mm-hmm. So if you study the profile of these cities as it has evolved over the last 30 years through open migration and through where the concentration of the urban wealth is, where the major institutions are located, the universities, the media, the financial centers, and the international business. This is where the vote came in the British case in 2016, June, for remaining. That was the rejection of Brexit. And then you have the rest of UK, where, to define it, is, I would say, where the English live, that is the UK of the Englishmen and women. And that was resoundingly for Brexit.
Now, how much, Salim, how much of the election result was due to a confirmation, another referendum, if you will, on Brexit, versus a rejection of Jeremy Corbyn's extreme Labour Party with his anti-Semitic views, his pro-terrorist views, pro-Palestinian views, and his plan and manifesto, he calls it quite appropriately because it's pure communism, of taking over, nationalizing half the country. How much was anti-Corbyn versus pro-conservative Brexit?
Well, it is a mix of all of that. The vote was definitely against the Labour Party, that is against Jeremy Corbyn. There was a clear indication that Corbyn was a radical Marxist, not someone that was patently British Marxist, in whatever form you might call them, social democratic, somewhat more focused on Britain and the British working class. No, I mean, Corbyn was openly embracing all the Maoists, all the Palestinian Hamas and killers, openly embracing the Venezuelan, the Cuban, etc. So he was openly, in that sense, a Marxist of the old type, of the first international type, internationalist in that sense. And his manifesto, which he came out with, which you just now referred to ahead of the election, was a brutal declaration of what his government was looking towards. That is, massive nationalization, massive taxation, and revamping the British system in terms of more oriented to what basically has now become a globalist agenda, and here you have, there again is the irony that the hard Marxists are now to be found in the largest, most successful international corporations and the business class, the people who gather in Davos, Switzerland annually to talk about it. So yes, it was about, number one, it was a Brexit vote. This was a rally. That was what Boris Johnson said. Enough. One word, enough, and let's get it done. It is almost getting on to 4 years since the British referendum. And what did the Conservative Party do in these almost 4 years, 3.5 years? They basically dithered. The people had spoken. Democracy had spoken. Here is the mother of parliament that invented democracy, going all the way back to Magna Carta. The people had spoken, had given their decision. They wanted to leave the European Union, and the Conservative Party under Theresa May tried to soften it up and play games around it, and then called an election in which they lost their majority. When David Cameron, as the Conservative leader, called the referendum in June of 2016, he was confident, the Conservative at that time under David Cameron was confident that they will win the referendum, that is, Remain will win. And he lost that bet, and he lost his leadership. He stepped down, he resigned, and Theresa May filled that position. And she did nothing in the terms of getting the Brexit vote through the parliament. In fact, they called an election and they lost their majority. And so this was, in that sense, a Brexit vote. But in that also added, as you have pointed out, this was a vote in which the Labour Party lost, and let's emphasize that, lost its own constituency, that is the working class.
What we've seen just recently, a number of Labour MPs crossed the floor, or at least sat as independents, because the Labour Party no longer represented the party that they joined or their parents joined.
That's right. Look at the great irony. Whether this is now going to hold in time, that's another thing. But the historic vote of this election in 2019 is that the Conservative Party of Boris Johnson is now more or less the party of the working class, the party of the middle and lower middle class, the party of the small business owners, the party of the shop owners. It is the party of the people of Britain, as opposed to what we are talking about, the elite, and the people who live off the crumbs from the elite table, that is, the people in the big metropolitan centers. Let's take quick numbers, Robert. 650 seat parliament, multi-party election, and Boris Johnson's Conservative won, as I have the numbers right in front of me, 365 seats. That is, they gained 47 seats going into this election from the previous number that they were holding, which was something like 325 seats.
Well, I think they went from 317 to 365 for a gain of 48. Yeah,
that's right, exactly. And the Labour collapsed to 203 seats. Now, interestingly, to put it in a historical context, this is the election in the environment of what we are seeing, the great rupture in the politics of the Western democracies. Mm-hmm. That we have in some ways talked about it, that is the rise of globalism, or the elite turning towards globalism and adopting globalist value. The 2016 election referendum was the harbinger of that. And then came the 2016 election in America with the election of Donald Trump. And now you have the confirmation of this rupture, 2019 election in Britain. But if you go back historically and make a little bit of comparison, you have to go back all the way to 1983 with the election
Margaret Thatcher.
Margaret Thatcher, which was, as I look at the number right here, Robert, in front of me, the 1983 election was as massive, if not even greater, victory for Maggie Thatcher after she had become the leader of the Conservative Party. She had won the 1979 election. Then they had the Falkland War in 1981-82. And then she came out of the Falkland War and called the election in 1983. And she was confronted by Michael Foot of the Labour Party, which at that time was considered, Michael Foot was considered the hard left leader of the Labour Party. And the manifesto of the Labour Party going into the election was considered the most extreme manifesto. But nobody ever said that Michael Foot was so openly and radically an anti-Semite and anti-Jew in the context of British politics, as is Jeremy Corbyn. But the result of 1983 election was the Conservative Party won 397 seats. Boris has won 365 seats. So Maggie Thatcher won 30 more seats than Boris Johnson. The gain was 58 seats for Maggie Thatcher over the 1979 election. And the Labour Party under Michael Foot collapsed to 209 seats, just about the same as where Jeremy Corbyn is. And the loss for Labour was 60 seats. They lost 60 seats, and Jeremy Corbyn lost 59 seats. So I find this is very interesting. It is almost a parallel that you have. But England of 1983 was a much different England in terms of the changes that have taken place in England. I mean, in 1983, England was not a member of the European Union. It had become a member of the EEC, but it had become a member, but had not given up. And Mrs. Thatcher was warning where Britain would be going. She was opposed to it. It was a decision made by the previous Conservative leader, Edward Heath, that took Britain into the European Economic Community. But the Cold War was on. It was still the height of the Cold War. The Afghan War was going on. The Soviet Union had gone into Afghanistan. The Middle East was as hot as ever. 1979, the Iranian Revolution had taken place. America had barely gotten out of the hostage crisis. If you take your mind back to the early 1980s, after the Iranians had held American diplomats hostage for over a year.
Until Ronald Reagan was inaugurated, and at that very moment he was inaugurated, the Ayatollah let them go. Yeah.
Exactly, on the very day. So the context was very different, and the sense of the Cold War was clearly that the world was divided into two camps, and it was, on the one side was the free world, on the other side the communists led by the Soviet Union. But today, how many years later? 1983, that is 36 years later. Yeah, almost 40 years later. We are in a totally different world. We are in the 21st century. The Cold War is a history.
Immigration has changed as well because, well, back in the 60s, you had Enoch Powell being rather prescient in warning Britain about immigration changing the culture of that country. And of course, since 1983, we've seen a massive influx of immigrants into the UK, particularly into London and the urban centres, radically changing the culture of that country. And I think perhaps this election may have spared that nation by the skin of its teeth from getting into a situation which it could never get out of again.
Absolutely. I mean, it is very interesting that you remember Enoch Powell, and you have referred to Enoch Powell, his famous speech,
Rivers of Blood.
Blood in the Tiber, of 1968. in Birmingham. Enoch Powell was a shadow cabinet minister in Edward Heath's Conservative Party. They were in opposition at that time. In 1968, it was Wilson's government. Harold Wilson was the prime minister. And Enoch Powell's, that famous speech, was a warning of where Britain was headed in terms of what at that time they were considering opening up British immigration to the rest of the world, particularly from the former British Empire, the colonies in Africa and Asia. And his warning was that Britain would change if this is not done properly, and if it's not done, in some sort of controlled fashion, and that change would be almost irrevocable. And so his warning shot was, yes, in 50 years we have seen how much Britain has changed, from the gang rapes in Rotherham of young girls by Pakistani immigrants who have turned these inner cities into enclaves, and particularly where the Muslim Brotherhood ideology had penetrated, that is the Sharia and Islamism that you and I have talked about, a great deal. Britain has changed.
And of course, they all vote Labour. If you look at the map, it's all Labour.
They all vote Labour. I was going to point out just that where Enoch Powell had talked about blood flowing in the street, we saw blood flow in the street in London where they decapitated that British soldier, Rigby. So these are all that has happened, and he was prescient, he was prophetic, and it is all accelerated after the collapse of the Cold War. So what we have here is the British people, and this is where I think the lesson for us in Canada is, as the lesson was in United States, that again the media deliberately, it's not the question they missed it, it is now media is fake news, as what Donald Trump has talked about it. What you read in the media, that is the corporate media, I think we should now make it very clear that what you read in the corporate media, you should do what George Orwell said, translate it to just the opposite. So the media says that Hillary Clinton is going to win 90, the needle is on 90 plus possibility on the evening of the election, then read the opposite, that Trump is going to win.
If I could just ask you a question, Salim, to bring it somewhat home to Canada. What are your impressions of the fact that the Brexit Party over in England or over in the UK didn't get a seat? Jo Swinson of the Lib Dems didn't even win her seat. Scottish National Party, while it won most of Scotland, it only represents 3.9% of the popular vote. You still have, over in Britain, two main parties. Now, parallel that to Canada, where we only just last year started our popular movement with Maxime Bernier's People's Party of Canada, garnering a remarkable 1.6% of the vote and 300,000 votes in just a single year. Are we missing the boat? I mean, look at the people of populist leaders who have marginal to great success in Europe, and that Marine Le Pen in France, Orbán in Hungary, Salvini, Geert Wilders in Netherlands, Abascal in Spain, Dahl in Denmark, Trump in the United States. Are we missing the boat? One commentator on Sky News Australia said that this is going to be great news for the Anglosphere, except for Canada, which seems to be the odd man out. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, my thoughts on that are, the parallel that you can make, since you have mentioned some of the issues, the Scottish vote, SNP came out very strong in Scotland, even though Conservative made gains in Scotland, and Scotland in that sense is divided between SNP, the Scottish Nationalist Party that is seeking independence, and the Conservative gains in Scotland. The fact does remain that, let's say, the Scottish Separatist Party is parallel with our Bloc Québécois. So Scotland, in that sense, is analogous to Quebec. And in the last election here, 2 months ago, we saw the revival in that sense. The conservative totally collapsed in Quebec, made no gain. We, PPC, we lost the one seat that we had, Maxine, but it was the Bloc that came out. Bloc had been reduced to a marginal party in the House of Commons, but came out with 34 seats in Quebec. So we have that interesting parallel. For the rest of Canada, we talked about it. It is the urban whole that is where the Liberals are, which is the new Canadian vote, the immigrant vote, right across the urban centers of Canada, exception being Calgary. So yes, I mean, at the moment, the snapshot is 2019 election in Canada, that Canada is standing apart from the Anglosphere, the Anglo-American sphere. But my sense of it is that because there wasn't a strong conservative opposition in Canada, I mean, there was nothing from Andrew Scheer, who has now become history as he has stepped down, resigned, and I believe surrounded by scandal. And the question is whether the media is going to probe into that. There was no place for the conservative vote to go to, and PPC didn't have the time or the resources to build it. So we are in a work in progress. I think that Canada is not an exception, and the conservative vote will come through the PPC in the next cycle of election. I also believe that, or I would argue that we might be in a cycle of minority parliaments, as happened, when in 2004 with Paul Martin, 2006 with Harper, 2008 with Harper, we might be back in some sort of a cycle of 2 or 3 elections before we get into a majority situation. But more importantly, I think what has happened, what it has demonstrated in terms of Western democracy, both Britain and the country that you have pointed out in Europe, that is the resistance to the globalists has risen very sharply. People have become much more aware, except now for Canada in the 2019, of what the actual fight is all about. The elite want to move away from nation states. And moving away from nation states means the elite want to run politics without being accountable. Nation state governance means to be accountable to your people, to your voters, to your electorate, to meeting your need. And you take the case of the British Labour Party, where the working class Englishmen and women have now voted for the conservative seats that were for 50 years, in some almost 100 years, that turned in Midlands, in North England, to vote for the conservative. What does it mean? It means, back again to almost the biblical statement, man does not live by bread alone. There is a deep cultural issue, the deep culture of England, around which is the idea of the English nation state, that we are a people. We have our own values. We have our own, way to understand our religious tradition, our own language, our own history, and we are going to protect them. And that's the nation state. And the globalist movement has been gaining grounds until Brexit happened, the Brexit referendum, and then the Trump election. And now you can see the escalation of that opposition in Europe, with the Yellow Vest in France, with the election of Salvini in Italy, and so on. That is, the people are awakening to the fact that the two globalist center in the world, for the European, it is the European Union that want to end the nation state system, whose origin goes back more than 300 years to 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia, ending the 30 years of religious warfare and coming together, or the first beginning of the nation state system. So they want to end that, they want to destroy that, eliminate that, and create that central institution, the globalist institution in Brussels, for the European Union, for the United Nations in Geneva and New York. And we in Canada, we have signed on to this. I mean, both our major party. I mean, it's not only the Liberals are now completely globalist party. Not only completely globalist party, I would say, the Liberals are also now the party of the new Canadians. They don't care about, to make that distinction between old stock Canadians or Canadian immigrants in the first century of Canadian politics, that is 1867, 1967, they no longer care, and that was evident in this last election. They only elected 4 members in the parliament between the Ontario-Manitoba border and the Alberta-British Columbia border, but here they are minority government with the NDP, which is similarly like the British Labour Party. So we have work to do over here. But right now, it is a sense of, some vindication in a major sense, of where you and I, we have been talking about this, that, there is this pushback taking place, and Boris Johnson's election victory is an immense shot in the arms of every one of us in Western democracy and in the Anglo-American sphere, that those of us who are opposed to globalism and want to defend our national sovereignty, our national state, an immense shot in our arm.
Yeah. We'll have to leave it there, Salim. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert.